Hi there, welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords September 2022 AMA session. I'm Andrew Schultz, Community Manager here at Rent Prep. I'm also a licensed real estate broker and property manager with over 14 years of experience in the rental industry. I'm being joined behind the scenes today by Josh, who's helping me moderate the chat, as well as keeping me updated on any questions that pop up in the chat so that I can keep that up as well. We were slated to have Carlos with us today on screen, but unfortunately he was unable to join us for this one. But thank you for joining us today. We've got a lot of great topics to discuss, and we're going to get to that in just a couple of moments here, but I do have a couple of quick housekeeping items first and foremost. Number one, RentPrep is a tenant screening company, not a law firm or an accounting firm. I'm not an attorney, I'm not an accountant, and I'm not a financial planner. Every situation is unique, and nothing in this AMA should constitute legal or financial advice. You should absolutely take your unique situation to your local team of experts before taking any action based on anything you hear in this or any other video anywhere on the internet. Work with your local experts first and foremost. And number two, if you haven't joined already, check out the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. That's over at facebook.com/groups/rentprep. We're on the march for 13,000 members over there right now, and we're one of the most active, curated groups of housing providers on Facebook. You're not going to find tenants in this group. It's strictly landlord, and we vet every person that joins. You are missing out if you're not in that group. Check it out today, facebook.com/groups/rentprep. Now, if you haven't seen our AMAs before, here's how it works. AMA stands for Ask Me Anything. So what happened was a couple weeks ago, we posted a link into our Facebook group where you could ask questions to be answered during this AMA session. And I think we grabbed a couple of the best topics from the group at large as well. You can also add a question into the chat if you're watching live, and we'll try to grab some of those towards the end of the hour. I think we're slated for about an hour on this. But anyway, we've got a whole lot that we're going to be taking a look at today. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. Let me just make sure that I have Josh with me. Josh, if you could just drop a quick message into the Slack chat so I know that you're with me. And we're going to start with this question from Sherry. I have a couple, age 60, renting a 1,550 square foot home in California. The husband has recently revealed that the wife is mentally ill. As a result, all of the screens have been removed or cut open. All windows and doors are left open all year round because she can't breathe if closed. I had to enter the home to check the fire extinguisher and notice that she's hoarding boxes and bags of stuff, leaving only small paths to walk. They are on a month-to-month lease agreement. Can I remove them to avoid damage to the interior, which will exceed their deposit with these unusual behaviors? Other behaviors over the last 3 years have affected the kitchen gas stove and covering the intake vent to the heater system with plastic. The husband assures me that they're not using the heater or air system in the house. This one came to us via the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group, I think. Boy, what a situation. So, depending on the state that you're in, and you say in California here, so I would probably venture a guess that hoarding is considered an illness in California, a mental illness in California, where someone could seek treatment and get access to some resources and things like that might help that person out in the eventuality that they need this treatment. And honestly, it sounds to me like they're in a situation where they probably need this treatment. Just based off the last line of the question, which was the husband assures me that they're not using the heater or the air system in the house. It sounds to me like these are not ideal tenants, obviously, to have a continued relationship with. And with them being on a month-to-month agreement, I would probably be looking, number one, to see if I can help them access some resources that would allow them to possibly stay in the house, get some help with the hoarding situation, get some help with the wife's mental health issues and things of that nature. But ultimately, if that's not something that the tenants are interested in, or if that's not something that can be done, I would probably have to move forward with an eviction in this instance. As much as it sucks, no one wants to have to move forward with an eviction, but this would be one of those examples where they're causing damage to the property. And not for nothing, the amount of stuff that people can hoard can cause serious issues when it comes to the amount of weight in a property. I know that we talked about this in a podcast episode a while back about all of the various damages that hoarders can do, just around, not even as a direct result of like hoarding, but you can create hazardous material situations, and hoarding's just bad no matter how you slice it. Having been in a few hoarder homes in my day, you feel for the people because you understand that they are going through some sort of a mental illness, but by the same token, the amount of destruction that can wreak on a property is bad. So For a situation like this, like I said, I would probably start off by trying to help the tenant access some resources that could help them. If the tenant's not interested in that, they would be getting issued, actually regardless, they would be getting issued a notice to cure. And then if they are unable to cure the problem with the hoarding and things of that nature, unfortunately, I would be moving towards an eviction on this one. I would certainly recommend, this is a very unique situation because you do have someone that is suffering from a recognized mental health illness. You should probably have a conversation with an attorney on this one to see what their recommendation is with regards to the entire process, essentially, of, okay, how do I do this without it coming across as though I'm just trying to throw this tenant out because they have a mental illness. So there's a little bit of back and forth on something like that. But good luck to you on that one. I think that that's a situation that's going to take some time to iron itself out. On to our next question. This one is from Nuri. I would like to install heat pumps in each unit of my duplex, but cannot afford it. Will there be any federal, state, or local tax incentives or grants to assist landlords when upgrading their units to replace older wall furnaces with energy-efficient heat pumps? My property is in Oakland, California. So I can tell you that most of the information that you're going to find with regards to tax incentives and stuff like that typically comes out either from EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and you can find their website at epa.gov. The other thing that you can do is check with your local utility providers. In a lot of instances, I know that it seems here in Western New York, the big push the last few years has been smart home thermostats and LED bulbs and stuff like that the energy providers are pushing. They want people to install the smart thermostats especially, but there have been some incentives for replacement of older air conditioners and older furnace units where you upgrade to a high efficiency. So say you're going from an 80% efficiency forced air furnace up to a 95% efficiency forced air furnace. They're going to give you some sort of an incentive to do that to help offset some of that cost. All of that information is available right on the utility providers' websites, at least here in Western New York. We actually did have a furnace installed in one of our units. I guess it's been about a year now, probably almost a year to the day now that I'm thinking about it. We had a high efficiency furnace replaced in one of our buildings last year, just a single family home. And we had to submit some paperwork back to the utility company, basically just the invoice showing the make and model of the new furnace, and we had to submit pictures showing that the new furnace was in place. I think they also required us to submit a picture of the old furnace once it was removed as well, to show that there had been an actual furnace removed or something like that. It took, if I remember correctly, something like 6 weeks, and then they sent us a check for a couple $100, maybe $500, something like that, as part of the incentive package. So it definitely helped to offset the cost of the forced air unit. And it definitely, you're going to end up fronting that money in most instances. So I don't know as though there's necessarily an incentive right off the bat. More often than not, you wind up fronting the money and then getting either a tax credit back or getting a incentive back from the utility provider, either as a discount on your utilities or as a check as a result of the incentive program or something along those lines. Other than that, I would check over at epa.gov. Or certainly talk to any of the companies in your area that do HVAC installs. They should be able to give you a pretty good indication as to whether or not there are any incentives out there in the marketplace currently. All right, on to our next question. This one is from Lydia, and I apologize if you guys see me drinking more water than usual. I've got a little bit of a tickle in my throat today. I'm trying to keep it to a minimum, so you'll probably just see me sipping water more frequently. Question from Lydia. What to do if the tenant hasn't paid rent in months, was notified that the landlord, which in this case is Lydia, has filed for eviction, and now it seems that the tenant has someone else staying there, but she has left. So this is an interesting question. Tenant hasn't paid rent in months, was notified that the landlord has filed for eviction, and now it seems like there's someone else living in the unit and that tenant has left. So it sounds like the tenant may have illegally subletted the unit down the line, for lack of a better term. It sounds like basically what happened was the tenant that you rented to turned around and re-rented the unit to somebody else, probably claiming that they were either authorized to sublet it or that they were the landlord themselves, knowing that they had this eviction coming down the pipeline and basically leaving the new tenant stuck with it. So this question does not actually mention what state you're in, so I'll give a little bit of generic advice based on what I know about eviction laws here in New York State. And one of the things that our attorneys always encourage us to do is whenever we're filling out our initial notice paperwork, which in New York State is a delinquency notice that has to be sent certified mail, and then a 14-day notice that you have intent to file a court claim, essentially, they always tell us to name every tenant that we know living in the unit and all other occupants known and unknown. And they tell us to do that because essentially that covers all of your John and Jane Does that might be living in the property that you don't know about. It also covers minors and things of that nature who may not be on the lease but might be living in the apartment. So that was the recommendation from our attorney, and whenever we filed paperwork and we include that language, and the specific language that we've been told to include is, and all other occupants known and unknown, is how they want it written here in the great state of New York. Your mileage may vary depending on where you're at, but that's how they want us to write it, to make sure that we're including kind of everyone who's associated with the unit, whether they're named on the lease, not named on the lease, responsible party, just an additional occupant. Everybody it's basically a catch-all to get everybody. So that's how we file our paperwork here in New York State. So based on that, with how we file our paperwork, that would actually be the solution to your problem here. Essentially, the new tenant, if you will, would wind up getting evicted as a subtenant of the first tenant because that first tenant is being evicted. So in this instance, the eviction action, assuming it was filed correctly against the first tenant, should, in theory, clear the second tenant out of there as well. You should be able to get your eviction processed and actually get that tenant removed from the property. Now, once you get to court, anything could happen. I mean, judges, I've seen some stuff come out from judges that I think is absolutely ludicrous, but again, you know, once you get to the courthouse, anything could happen at the judge's bench, if you will. And I think that there are some judges that are more inclined to keep it to the letter of the law, and I think that there are some judges that are more inclined to play it fast and loose, depending on what they think they can get away with in their jurisdiction or whatever the case may be. I don't know what the logic is that some judges use, but you know, I have seen judges in the past that if you don't file paperwork correctly, they'll just throw the entire thing out and you're starting from square one. So it's one of those situations where when you start an eviction proceeding, you want to make sure that your paperwork is crystal clear, because that's going to make the entire process run a lot smoother. I know obviously we talk about speaking with attorneys all the time. At this point in the world, at this point in 2022, having just come out of COVID, I think most states have dropped their COVID restrictions at this point, but there are so many ins and outs when it comes to processing an eviction through the system. At pretty much any point in any state at this time, there's more ins and outs than anybody's really able to stay afloat of if you have just one or two units and you're not doing evictions on a regular basis. That's the point where I would recommend getting in touch with an attorney, a landlord-tenant attorney that does evictions on a regular basis. Turf it to them, because yeah, you're going to spend a little bit of money, but number one, you don't have to worry about it once it's been turfed to the attorney. Number two, the attorney knows the law inside and out, assuming you hired the correct attorney, and they're going to be there to represent your best interests. And number three, there are so many things that you could say or do to misstep when it comes to an eviction proceeding that could reset you or set you even further back. In my world, it's worth spending the money on an attorney just to know that we're going to be able to reclaim that asset, get control of that asset back way before if you were to sit and go through the entire process and everything else. One other thing that's worth mentioning here is that you could offer a cash for key scenario to the existing or the secondary tenant to try to get them to leave. I don't know how successful you're going to be in that instance, because realistically speaking, the secondary tenant probably has no idea who you are and is going to be completely blindsided by the situation when you approach them about it, assuming you haven't done that already. But you might be able to do a cash for key scenario and save yourself a little bit of cash with the secondary tenants. Realistically though, with this situation being as messy as it is already, I would probably go the full route of getting an eviction just to make sure that I had the asset back in my control and there was no question as to whether or not anyone else had access or authority to enter the property or anything along those lines. That pretty much wraps up that question. I think we did a pretty good service on that one. We have two questions back to back here. They're on kind of a similar topic, so I'm going to read them out together and then we'll answer both. First question here is from Wayne. How can I evict a roommate drinking almost every day and causing problems for the other two roommates in a shared home? And then a question from Laura, just a generic, how do I evict a roommate? So we'll talk a little bit more. Sorry, you guys just got a real big view of my forehead there. We'll talk a little bit more about evictions here. I know we were just talking about that in the last question as well. But we'll talk a little bit more specifically about when you have a household situation where only one person in the household needs to be evicted and you may have multiple tenants living in the home. So to put this into context, one of the most classic examples where we used to see this happen was in our student rentals by University at Buffalo South Campus. When we were still managing a lot of those properties, the main issue we had was you would get 4 girls or 4 guys that would move in at the beginning of a semester. They would all know each other because they came to us. We never did tenant placement and put people together. They would come to us with a group and say, hey, we're ready to rent this home. So you would make the assumption, okay, these people know each other, they're friends, or whatever the case may be. They're going to be able to live together for a period of a full calendar year or semester or whatever the case may be. The amount of infighting we saw inside these apartments was unreal sometimes. And a lot of times it was over typical drama or nonsense, or, someone has a drinking problem or someone has developed a drug habit, and suddenly that person should not be in the apartment anymore, should not be in the home anymore. And how do you go about evicting just one person? Or can you evict just one person? Or do you have to evict the entire house? And in a situation like this, if you have a situation where it's one roommate that's drinking and causing issues, if all of the roommates are on the lease together, you're probably going to have to speak to your landlord and have a conversation and say, hey, one of our roommates, we need this one tenant evicted or one tenant removed from the lease. Depending on your state law, they may have to evict the entire household and then re-rent to 3 out of the 4 tenants or whatever the case may be. Now, let's look at this from a little different perspective. Let's assume that either Wayne or Laura are the landlord in this instance, and that they don't have to wait for their outside landlord, third party, to take care of the situation for them. What do you do to evict just one person if they're in a roommate situation or something like that? So for instance, we'll take Laura's situation here. We'll assume that she's in a 2-bedroom apartment. She lives in one bedroom and the roommate lives in the other bedroom. Laura owns the apartment, or Laura is the main tenant on the apartment, which would make her, in essence, the landlord here. Laura would need to file that eviction against the roommate on her behalf, essentially. So in this instance, Laura would go to the courthouse. Actually, Laura would have to go through and do the entire process, the full eviction process. So she would have to issue a late rent notice or a termination of tenancy notice, whatever the case may be. And then she would have to go through the entire formal eviction process in a court of law, more than likely, assuming that there's, a lease in place and things of that nature, making it a true tenancy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of situations where people have someone that moves into them. There's never any paperwork or anything like that put in place. And that's where the situation can get real sticky, especially when you're talking about a situation where you need someone to move out. So my recommendation is anytime you're dealing in a situation where you're going to have roommates moving in, whether you own the property and you're doing a house hack where you're renting rooms out individually, which is probably more the situation with Laura, and then dealing with a situation like Wayne, I'm guessing that's more of a college situation where you've got maybe 3 or 4 guys living in a house. One guy has developed a situation. You may need to go to your landlord to deal with that because you may not be authorized as the landlord in this instance. If all 3 of you are renting, all 3 of you are named on the lease as tenants, you would probably have to go to your landlord and ask for that one tenant to be removed. So just different situations depending on whether you're truly the landlord or whether you're stuck on a lease with these people and have to go through and do a partial eviction or something along those lines. Hopefully that answers that question. That's kind of a unique situation when you're dealing with roommates and not necessarily being the one in control of the ultimate situation, or whether or not you can even go to your landlord and say, hey, we got to get rid of this person. This is creating an issue. It's a safety concern, whatever the case may be. Kind of a sticky situation. I think I was starting to say, and I don't think I finished my comment earlier, if you're going to do something like this, make sure that you have paperwork in place. So if you're Laura in this instance and you have a spare room that you're renting out, have some sort of a lease in place. Make it a month to month if that's what makes you feel comfortable, so that you could terminate it and that person needs to move out more or less immediately. I'm always leery of house hack situations and stuff like that, though, because the second you hand somebody a piece of paper that says, hey, you have to move out of this house that I own that you've been living in, guess what? You're still living under the same roof as that person. So it can create real dicey situations. I do hope that both of you get your situations resolved. Definitely sticky when it comes to evicting just one person in a home where there are multiple people living there. I kind of walked through 2 different scenarios there, but hopefully that will play out and you guys will be able to deal with that situation. It's pretty unfortunate. All right, looks like we have another group of 2 questions. We'll go ahead and read these 2. And again, we'll do the same thing. This first one is a question from Clark. I have a great tenant who I would like to have renew her lease. She's paying slightly below market rate for her rental, and I think that she wants to renew, and she's in good shape financially, so a rent increase probably won't ruffle her. I've read on various blogs that you should always increase the rent on new leases, even if it's just a nominal amount. My costs have gone up a little this year due to property taxes and insurance. What are your thoughts on raising rent? And then a second question from Rob, right along the same guidelines here. With supplies and labor costs rising, how much should I raise my rent? I've had my house approximately 8 years and I live in the Cincinnati area. So essentially we have 2 different questions here, both dealing with the same general topic of how do I go about raising rent and how much should I raise rent? So the first thing you're going to want to do is check your state law to see if there are restrictions on how much, how frequently you can do a rent increase. So in some states, you can only do rent increases when you come up for lease renewal. In some states, you can only do rent increases of a certain percentage per year, things of that nature. So for instance, here in the state of New York, I don't believe that we have any restrictions on how often we can increase the rent, but we do have notification guidelines that we have to provide. So for instance, if you've been in the home, if the tenant's been in the home 1 year or less, or has a lease for 1 year or less, you would give them 30 days notice to alter their rent amount. If it's a 1 to 2 year tenancy, it'd be a 60-day, and then 2 years plus would be a 90-day notice that you have to provide for any sort of a rent increase or to terminate the tenancy in the state. So based on that, you then have to find out, okay, are there restrictions on how much I can increase it? And again, with the 30, 60, 90-day guideline that I just gave for the state of New York, that's if you're increasing rent by greater than 5% or equal to 5%. So if you are raising your rent by 4.5% every year, my understanding, and again, not an attorney, talk to your attorney, if you're raising your rent 4.5% per year, then you should be, in theory, able to do that with a 30-day notice. Again, talk to an attorney. If you're in the state of New York, don't just blindly trust that, because I know that there's also some other language written into the law with regards to CPI, Consumer Price Index. I think it's Consumer Price Index, and you can actually increase more than 5% in some instances based on that calculation. So there's a little bit of work that goes into it, is basically what I'm trying to convey here. And you really need to understand what the laws are at your state level when it comes to rent increases before you even attempt to increase your rent. Now, the next thing you're going to need to do is figure out what the process is for telling a tenant the rent's going up. In some instances, it's as simple as sending a letter. Sometimes it has to be personally served. Sometimes it may need to be sent certified mail, whatever the case may be. There will be a process outlined in your state law as to how that notice has to be delivered. Make sure that you follow that so that you know that when the notice actually expires, that the rent actually, goes up the way that it's supposed to. That's the entire premise behind it. Now, on the topic of how much should you increase rent, this is kind of it's a scenario by scenario type of thing. So the first thing I would say is, where is your rent currently in comparison to the rest of the market? And what I would do is look at the comparable apartments or comparable homes in your neighborhood and see what those are renting for. And if you are basically at or above, I probably would not recommend a rent increase, or I would be recommending a very small nominal rent increase. You don't necessarily want to outpace the market, but you do want to stay caught up with market rate. So if you look at the market and you find out, hey, I'm like $300 a month less than everybody in my area, now you should be looking to take moves to get you as close as possible to market rent. So if you need to give extra notice to make a bigger rent increase, or if you decide that you want to break it up 6 months and 6 months, we're going to increase it to 150 for 6 months and then another 150 6 months down the road. Figure out what your process is going to be for that. But I would try to stay as close to market value as possible. The reason I say that is because, at least here in New York, and I know in several other states, we are starting to see a push for rent control in different municipalities, or some instances even statewide. We're talking about rent control ballots being put on. And when something like that starts getting thrown around, you really have to think about the future, and you don't want to get caught in a situation where you are in a position where you haven't raised rent on a tenant in 5 or 10 years, and you're 5 or 10 years behind market value for that apartment, because you may never have the opportunity to bring that apartment up to market value if you can only increase, say, 3% per year no matter what, once you've gone into a rent-controlled scenario. So I don't know of any place that's currently threatening, like really on the edge of jumping into rent control. If anybody knows anything like that, do us a favor and let us know so that we can keep abreast of it. But it's definitely something to keep in mind. You know, it's one of those situations that if rent control were to rear its ugly head and you're way behind on your rent increases, it could have a nasty, nasty impact on your rental property and your ability to operate that property from now until forever. So it's definitely something to consider. Now, Rob had mentioned rising costs, and actually I guess Clark did too. Property taxes, property insurance, supplies, labor costs, everything. The cost of everything in real estate has gone up. Attorneys have gone up, closing costs have gone up, the cost of property has gone up. Literally everything in the real estate realm has gone up in value over the course of the last couple of years. And I don't think that we're going to see a major crash here in the near future. So I think that we're probably going to be dealing with these concerns on some level going forward. Even as we enter an economy, I guess we're talking about stagflation at this point, we're still going to have to deal with these issues. We're still going to have to make sure that the costs to operate the property are being covered by the rents with some kind of a profit margin thrown in there, because obviously none of us are looking to do this out of the kindness of our hearts. So at the end of the day, I think what you should be doing is at least once a year, factor in, add up all of your expenses for the property, figure out what it costs you to operate the property for a year, make sure that you're setting cash aside for maintenance reserves, for capital improvements, for things of that nature, and make sure that you're factoring in for property management, even if you're not using property management right now, because down the road someday, you might be unwilling or unable to manage the property yourself. Don't buy an investment thinking that you're never going to need a property manager, because there are a lot of people that have been forced into that situation without thinking about it. And if you don't factor for management on the front end, it can really bite you on the back end. So factor in all of your property expenses, run through a net sheet once a year, figure out what it costs you to operate your property. And once you have that information, you should be able to take that and kind of give yourself a rough idea of, okay, I need to make at least X dollar per month on this property in order for me to cover my expenses. I want to make a little bit above and beyond that, and you can kind of set your rent there. Most people are going to see that their property expenses are going to be in line with properties along a similar path, in a similar neighborhood, things of that nature, within reason. I mean, if you have a luxury home right next to something that's maybe only a level B or a level C home, yeah, the rents are going to be different. You got to be comparing apples to apples. You know, if you're renting in a Class B neighborhood and your home is a Class B home, you should be able to compare your home with other Class Bs in the neighborhood to get a pretty good idea of what you can charge for rent. On to our next question. This one is from Laura. I'm managing from out of state, but sometimes I need help from a live person to hand off keys, do a showing, or do an inspection. Are there property managers that will do this type of side work? So I think everybody's pretty well aware at this point. I actually am a real estate broker. I own a property management company, and I can shed a little bit of light on this as to how property management companies would typically operate in a situation like this. So handing off a set of keys, doing a showing, doing an inspection, is that something that you're going to find a property management company that to handle the little odds and ends stuff for you? Maybe, but probably not. And the reason I say that is because property management companies take on a fairly large amount of liability whenever they sign a property management contract on a property. And if we're only doing very, very small things every once in a while on occasion or something like that, more often than not, it's not going to make sense for a property manager to engage in a property management contract to only be there once every 2 or 3 months to do a random thing here or there. So a property manager may not necessarily be what you're looking for in this instance. I think the better solution for you here is find a property management company or a real estate broker that does tenant placement and knows how to do tenant placement, credit and background checks, and screening criteria, this, that, and the other. There are property managers. As a matter of fact, we offer as a standalone service just tenant placement. It's the exact same tenant placement service that we offer to our full service management clients, but it's kind of we almost treat it like a foot in the door, to be honest with you. It's a way that we can introduce our services to a landlord that might not need management right now, but does need really good tenant placement. And more often than not, down the road, those leasing clients do become management clients because they've already had an intro to our services. That said, we do the tenant placement as a standalone service, number one, because Frankly, it's profitable. It's nice for us to be able to place tenants. Number two, we're good at it. And number three, because we do use it as a lead generator. So looking at it from that perspective, if you have a property management company that knows how to do a tenant placement to an exceedingly high level, it's worth paying that property management company to place that tenant because it gets you a foot in the door with them. Now, talking about things like a random inspection, handing off keys, something like that, you don't necessarily need a property manager for something like that. For something like that, you would probably be better served by having a handyman that you've built a relationship with, that you can trust to leave a set of keys with in the event that you need to have work done at the property and you're not there physically, so that they can help kind of coordinate that work. Again, if you were using a property manager, this would be something that would be in the purview of that management company to handle. They would be the ones that would go ahead and coordinate all your maintenance concerns and stuff like that on your behalf. But if it's not a situation where you need full service management, I would honestly try to find a good quality handyman that you could build a relationship up with, feed them your maintenance work on the property. It sounds like it's probably only one property. I think that that's probably your better bet, because I don't think that there are going to be too awful many property managers that want to go over and do just a quick inspection or hand off a key to somebody, something like that. That's not really the scope of what a property management company does. They're going to want more of a full service management solution, or they may be willing to do just a one-off tenant placement as kind of it's part of our good, better, best, to be honest with you. We do tenant placements. We have a mid-tier package and an upper-end package depending on what someone's looking for. And I think that you're better off finding either an agent or a property management company to just do that tenant placement, and then a handyman to kind of fill the rest of the gaps there if you don't need a full service property manager. That's actually an interesting one. It's interesting to dissuade people. I mean, I own a property management company. It's weird for me to try to dissuade people from using property management, but the fact of the matter is that you don't always need property management in every instance. I mentioned in the last question that you should be factoring for property management so that you can hire it if you need to, but it's nice to know that in some instances you can get by without. That said, if you're out of the area or out of the state, I would recommend having somebody local, somebody boots on the ground, just to cover yourself. On to the next question. This one comes from Leona. What are simple background checks for small towns? And this is an interesting question. I like this question because there's too many words in it. What are background checks is the question. It really doesn't matter where you live. Crime happens everywhere. I don't know if anybody else listens to true crime podcasts the way that I do, but crime happens everywhere. And it doesn't matter if you're in a major city or if you're in a small town. Crime happens everywhere. So there's no such thing as a background check for small towns. Maybe you're asking, do the records from a small town police department find their way into a larger database? And I think the general answer to that question is yes. I'm going to ask Josh to maybe give me a little bit more insight here in the chat that I can read out. But a background check is a background check is a background check in most instances, at least to the best of my knowledge. And you're either running a background check, a complete background check, or you're not running a complete background check. And when you ask me as a professional property manager, there's no question here. We run a background check on every person that applies for the apartment when we get to that stage of the game. If they've already qualified on their income, we've got their references and everything back, we get to the stage where we're running the credit and background checks. We're running those credit and background checks on every single person, and we have a written set of criteria as to how to deal with those background checks when they come back, depending on what appears on them. I'm not going to jump into all that. You can certainly check out the HUD guidelines for more information on that if that's what you're looking for. In terms of, what do I need to look for in background checks, HUD has a lot of good guidance on that, HUD.gov. But as far as what a background check is and what a background check is going to accomplish for you, a background check is a background check is a background check. There's different things that you can search for. You can do lien searches and judgment searches and things of that nature. But a criminal background check is going to be a criminal background check, regardless of whether someone lives in a small town or in a big city. Now, I will obviously plug RentPrep here, since we're on the RentPrep Ask Me Anything session. RentPrep provides tenant screening and background searches, things of that nature. You can obviously check out their website at rentprep.com. There's a ton of different packages out there available, but the nice thing about RentPrep is that their packages, like there's actual humans involved in the process. It's not just fill in a form, get a credit check back 30 seconds later that hasn't been looked at by a human. You have no idea if the information that's on there is even accurate or not. That's what sets RentPrep apart from everybody else out there in the tenant screening and background check game. I can tell you that at Own Buffalo, we've been using RentPrep for, I want to say, almost a decade now. Might even be a decade. I'm not sure when we started using them, but it definitely changed how we screen our tenants. And tenant screening is critical. It's one of those situations that it's a snapshot in time. There's nothing that says that you don't screen that tenant today, that tenant doesn't lose their job tomorrow and lose their sole source of revenue, sole source of income to pay you your rent money. But doing as much as you can on the front end will help you to prevent a lot of problems on the back end. And I would certainly recommend that you do a background check, criminal background check on everybody that you are thinking about placing in your unit. Hopefully that answers your question. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't really a difference between a background check in a small town or in a big city. It's all going to come from the same place. It's all going to be essentially one background check that you're going to run on that person. Next question is from Dave. What to do when fleas are found after the tenant security deposit is returned? The new tenant has no animals and didn't move in immediately. Some have recommended having a clause in the lease requiring all tenants with pets to treat for fleas at move out. That's actually a pretty good idea. As a matter of fact, it's such a good idea that I'm pretty sure we have it in our lease. And I'm actually trying to pull my lease up right now. Bear with me 1 second here while I attempt to grab that. And I'll show you the exact language that we use. Let's see, fleas. Let me switch to desktop mode here. So this is directly out of one of our pages of our lease here, and it's the section on pets. No pet shall be brought onto the premises, even temporarily, without the express written permission of the landlord. If a pet has been in the premises at any time during the tenant's occupancy, with or without landlord's consent, a charge may be made for defleeing, deodorizing, and or shampooing, and or damages occasioned by the pet. Any animals on their property not recognized under this rental agreement will be presumed to be strays and will be disposed of according to law at the option of the landlord. Now that last line is probably going to come out when we rewrite our lease, and there's also something else that I want to mention. We're going to update our language on that section of our lease so it no longer says pets, and instead says animals, because obviously we're dealing with a lot more emotional support animals and service animals at this point, which means that we need to update our lease language a little bit to make sure that we're still covering our bases. We're not going to get into a discussion on emotional support animals and service animals here, but I did want to point out that yes, you can put something in your lease that will allow you to essentially charge for damages as a result of the pet after that tenant has moved out. If you do have a tenant that's had a pet that had fleas, I would recommend having a defleeing treatment done in the property regardless. I think a lot of times you can have that done right alongside with carpet shampooing. I don't think exterminators typically need to be brought in for defleeing. I think a lot of carpet shampooers can help with that. I think they can add something into the shampoo that helps kill fleas and kill the eggs and stuff like that as they're doing carpet cleaning. Then obviously you get into situations where, okay, how do you know that the last tenant's animal brought the fleas in? I think it was either a last AMA or maybe it was a recent podcast episode. We were talking about someone bringing fleas in or bringing bed bugs in just by using a U-Haul that had been contaminated and improperly cleaned. So just because the current tenant has fleas in their home doesn't necessarily mean that it was the previous tenant's animals that caused it. There are other ways for something like that to happen. As far as dealing with it after the security deposit is returned, you could try to send a demand letter to the past tenant to get them to pay that bill, but good luck with it. You could try taking them to small claims court, but again, good luck with it. It's such a small amount, it's not going to be worthwhile. You're probably just going to wind up eating it on that one, but now you know that you can make an edit to your lease so that you do have some protections going forward. Now we're going to move into some questions from the Facebook group. I apologize. My throat's actually holding up better than I anticipated that it would. It was fine this morning, but it's getting a little worse as the day goes on here. But we're going to jump into our next question from Janice. And it reads, would you allow your tenants to place their own surveillance cameras up? Backstory, I have a 6-unit building with a common area hallway. One tenant complained that another tenant's cameras were pointed at her door and window. We took them down and told him the only camera he's allowed to have is pointing toward his own apartment door, nothing else. He put up a camera today facing the front door, main entrance, because he says he's had packages stolen. Our rental agreement says no remodeling or alterations of interior or exterior of the property allowed. We also have our own cameras on the side, on the property that face the front door and in the hallways for security purposes. So this is an interesting one, and it's especially interesting because we're starting to see it become more and more common, especially as it becomes easier and easier to install smart home technology. To put a Ring doorbell on the front of your house takes 15 minutes. To throw up a security camera nowadays takes roughly the same amount of time. You don't have to sit and run wires. A lot of this stuff is battery operated now, and it makes it very, very easy to introduce a camera into a scenario where a camera may or may not be allowed. So I'm not an attorney. I should probably preface this entire question by telling you that you need to speak to your attorney. And it's also worth noting that different states will have different laws with regards to where and when you can put recording and listening devices. So for instance, you may be able to record the video of what's happening in a hallway, but you may not be able to record the audio because there may be an expectation of privacy. In a common hallway, probably not. You're probably going to be able to record both. But you really need to understand what your state law is with regards to audiovisual surveillance before you just start throwing cameras up. Sometimes it's as simple as, oh, I need to put a sign up or whatever the case may be. Other times it may be more complicated than that, and there's certainly going to be restrictions on where you can place them and things of that nature. Now, as far as allowing a tenant to place their own security cameras up, we really don't. We don't want tenants drilling into properties. We don't want tenants hanging cameras anymore, at all, really. We don't want them doing stuff like that. Ring doorbells will usually allow. A lot of times a Ring doorbell can be literally applied to a door frame with a double-sided piece of tape, which is sufficient in a lot of instances for temporary installs for tenants and things like that. Ring doorbells we don't mind quite so much, but we don't want anything that is permanently affixed to the property because then it's a fixture and then you own it as a landlord and the tenant's going to try to take that when they move out. So we do have in our lease as well, no alterations, interior or exterior. That said, not every tenant is going to follow your lease, not every tenant is going to follow the rules, and not every tenant is going to follow the law, which is possibly the instance here when that tenant installed a camera that was facing into someone else's window. Now, do you have an expectation of privacy if you have your blinds open and there's a camera that's facing in your window, or even if someone's walking down the sidewalk and turns and looks in your window? Do you have an expectation of privacy? If your blinds are open, but you're in your house, I don't know what the law is on that, to be honest with you. I'm not even going to try to venture a guess. There's a lot of law that goes into something like this, and it's one of those situations where you really don't want to get into the middle of it if you don't have to. I would remove any camera that this tenant installs. There's no reason, at least as near as I can tell, that the tenant needs to have cameras put up. You have mentioned that you have a camera in the hallway. You also mentioned that you have a camera that faces the front door. So if the tenant had a camera or a package that was stolen and the package was located at the front door or in the hallway, which based on where he placed his camera, it sounds like that's probably the case, there's no reason for this tenant to have the camera because you already have the security of that area covered. So I would tell the tenant, no, you're not putting a camera up, in the common hallway facing into someone else's apartment. Definitely a no. I would just tell the tenant flat out, knock it off. And if they refuse to stop putting cameras up, I would just keep taking their cameras down. Eventually they're going to get sick of wasting their money on cameras. Honestly, at that point, I would probably start sending notices to cure. And if they still don't stop, we might be going down eviction road. So that's an interesting one. I think digital surveillance, as we move forward here, we're in 2020, and I think that digital surveillance is only going to continue to become a larger and larger hot button issue. There's not a lot of time nowadays when you're outside in the general public, especially in a major metro, where you're not on camera somewhere, whether it be a security camera, a traffic camera, whatever, somebody's errant Ring doorbell, you're just walking by and get captured. There are a lot of times where you're captured on video without even thinking about it. And I think that there's going to be a lot more consideration going forward as to how, when, where we use cameras, where we use this technology. And I think that you'll probably start to see people push back on it as they feel that their privacy gets further and further invaded. On to our next question from Edward. Hello all, newbie landlord here. My tenants are divorcing and the woman is moving out. It was her income and job history that qualified them. They are both on the lease. She's moving out this weekend and asked to be taken off the lease. I replied that moving out doesn't automatically mean that someone's taken off a lease, especially when they're the ones who qualified to rent it. But if the mail supplied proof of 3 times the rent and steady job history, that I would consider it. The man is now working on getting me his documentation. Am I doing okay so far? Am I missing anything? Any words of wisdom or gotchas that I should watch out for? Thank you so much. And again, this one comes from Edward, and this is on the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. I was actually involved in the conversation thread when this one was live. And I'll just kind of rehash some of the things here that I mentioned there because this was actually a really good question. And the one thing that I want to mention is actually something that Edward had already said. Just because you move out doesn't mean that you necessarily come off the lease. You signed that lease with that other party, and depending on how your lease is written, you are both jointly together and severally liable apart together for that lease. So just because you moved out doesn't mean that suddenly you're no longer responsible for the unit that you were living in. And based on that, I would not more than likely remove this woman from the lease, even if the male half brought forth the documentation showing that he had all of the rent money that he needed to and everything else. The reason for that is because having more people on the lease serves to protect the landlord. Just because this woman has moved out doesn't mean that this guy is not going to cause a whole bunch of damages to the property, not going to do a whole bunch of run up a whole bunch of bad debt in the form of unpaid rent, things of that nature. So having her on the lease, even if she's not physically living in the property, does give you a second party to go after in the event of damages or in the event of some sort of a situation where money winds up being due. So the more people on the lease, the merrier is kind of my theory. I probably would not remove this woman from the lease until the end of this lease term. Now, when you get to the next lease term, so let's say this is a 1-year lease, and you get to the end of the lease term and the male half has qualified himself on the lease, and you know that the female half is long gone. She's not even in the state anymore. She's gone. At that point, you're not going to force her to sign another 1-year lease with someone that she's obviously not living with. If you've gone through the process and you've requalified that male half and he's able to qualify for the apartment or for the home without her, then I would go forward and just lease the apartment or the home to him going forward without the other party on the lease. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is there had to have been a security deposit at some point here. We tell the tenants that they need to figure out the security deposit on their own and then tell us what they have decided. So if he's going to remain in the home, maybe he's going to pay her out half the security deposit. They need to sign something to that effect and send us the paperwork. We're not getting in the middle of it. When the tenant, whoever is still living there, moves out at the end of whatever lease term we're at that point, we deal with the security deposit based on who's living in the apartment at that time. Typically what we do is if it's a multiple party situation living in the unit, we cut one check to all parties. They can get together and make the decision as to how they want to distribute the security deposit funds amongst themselves. We try to stay out of that as much as possible because people do all sorts of crazy stuff when it comes to how they want to split up their deposits, or you pay 1/3 of the security deposit and I'll pay 2/3 because I'm getting the bigger bedroom, or we just don't want to be in the middle of it. So we let the tenants handle that. And as long as we get paid a full security deposit and a full month of rent, that's really what we're ultimately looking for. But again, going back to your question, I don't think that you're really missing anything so far. Watch out for the security deposit, because I know that that'll become a situation. I would not necessarily be in a giant hurry to remove her from the lease, much the same as you were not in a big hurry to remove her from the lease. And I think that that actually puts you in a more advantageous situation as the property owner. I would carry her on that lease at least to the end of the lease term, and then assuming the other party was able to qualify themselves, at that point I would release the property just to them. That was a pretty good question. I like that one. On to our next question here from Paul. I've had a bad tenant for about 5 years, and recently he keeps delaying the payments. Last month he barely paid the rent without the late fee. This month he said he paid the rent on time, but it's not showing up in my bank transactions, and he couldn't show me the bank transaction history on his end. He says he will figure it out after he comes back to town next week. I wonder if I need to send an eviction letter now or wait a couple of days. Thanks always. You should have been sending the eviction letter the second that the guy was late, to be honest with you. And this is It's a situation, and I'm calling you out on this one, Paul, and I apologize, but I'm just as guilty as you are. There have been instances where I've thought, all right, I'm just going to wait the couple days. They're going to be back. We'll deal with the situation. Every single time that we make a decision to wait, all it does is delay getting the asset back under your control. Do not wait to issue whatever notices you need to issue for an eviction. You can always rescind an eviction notice, but you cannot go back in time to hand the tenant the notice 2 weeks ago to fast forward the process. Don't delay when it comes to eviction notices. Get them out the door right away. You can always rescind them. It shows the tenant that you're serious about getting the situation resolved. And I think that more often than not, if the tenant intends to resolve that situation, they're going to resolve it long before you get to court. So giving them that notice, yes, it's putting them on point that they need to get this dealt with. And if the tenant is planning on dealing with the situation, they'll deal with it at that time before you ever get to court. But don't delay in getting those notices out the door. If you have a tenant that's delinquent, don't wait. Even if you've got a payment plan in place, even if the tenant has a story, whatever the situation may be, put the notice out, even if you have a signed payment plan. If you have a payment plan with that tenant that's signed, still issue the notices, because you can probably still move forward. Maybe you'll have to modify your notices when you get to the court or whatever the case may be. But getting something in place and then knowing that you have, as a backup plan, the ability to walk into court and file that eviction puts you in a much, much, much more advantageous space. So that's what I would do. I would make sure that you're filing that paperwork or serving that paperwork as soon as possible to make sure that it is taken care of, squared away, and that you have that as an option rather than putting yourself 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks further down the pipeline. Next question from Laveda. Should I do a walkthrough in the presence of the tenant or by myself after they leave? Which is best? So I will preface this one by saying, check your state law. Some states require you to do your walkout inspections with the tenant present. My theory on this is if you're not required to have the presence of the tenant for the walkout inspection, don't have the tenant present for the walkout inspection. It's just going to create issues because you're going to be walking through and trying to look at damages, look at this property, make sure you're getting it back. The tenant's going to be telling you, oh, that was like that when I moved in. Oh, I reported that to you 6 months ago. Oh, I don't know what happened to that. It makes a hectic situation a lot more hectic when you can't focus on what you're doing and you have to deal with the tenant. My recommendation is if you're in a state that allows for you to do your walkthroughs without the tenant present, that's the route that I would go. Do the walkthrough without the tenant present. If you have damages, take pictures of the damages. If you have move-in photos, you can compare your move-in and move-out photos. I've even taken and shown the move-out photo and the move-in photo and the move-out photo right next to each other to show tenants, yeah, you did cause this damage, and no, this is not reasonable wear and tear at any instance. And it's nice to have information like that. So doing a move-out inspection is critical for finding that sort of stuff, but doing your move-in inspection is just as critical. Getting back to the question, should you do it with the tenant present? No. If you can avoid it, I would avoid it at all costs. You're going to be a lot smoother, a lot calmer, a lot more at ease walking through solo where you can take your time, open and close a window, open and close a door, get down with a flashlight, look at something if that's what it takes. Check your stove burners, check your fridge shelves to make sure that everything is the way that it's supposed to be. Being rushed in a situation like this will lead to mistakes. So if you do live in a state where you don't have to have the tenant present, again, that would be my recommendation. Check your state law, make sure you understand what the time frame is that you have within that you have to refund the tenant security deposit. In New York State, I think it's now 14 days we have to refund the security deposit. So make sure that you're doing, and there's actually a process, by the way. If you're in the state of New York, there's a pre-inspection, and anyway, talk to a property manager or a competent legal counsel if you're not up to speed on that and you are in the state of New York. On to our next question. This one is from Myrna, and this is a question on collecting rent. If you have two roommates who share the rent and both are on the lease, do you receive only one deposit monthly for the rent, or would you allow each to pay their half of the monthly rent, and why? So the nice thing is we use property management software. We're currently using Appfolio, but we've used others in the past, and there's a bunch of them out there. But that allows us to take payments online. So a tenant can log on to their portal and they can make a rent payment with their routing and account number, with a debit card, with a credit card. We also offer the ability for tenants to drop checks off here at the office in our Dropbox. They can walk into a 7-Eleven, a CVS, or a Walmart and pay their rent there using Pay Near Me. If you can't get rent funds to us, you're not trying, is essentially what it boils down to. And I don't care how many payments we receive, as long as we have a $0 balance on that rental account at the end of the month. So, or at the end of, or on the first of the month, I should say. So if you have 5 roommates and it's $1,000 a month rent and each one wants to pay $200 and they want to send 5 separate checks, I don't care. If you have 5 tenants and you want one tenant to write a rent check every month, so that you have one tenant or one check that comes in, fine, I don't care. At the end of the day, what matters to me is not how many pieces of paper I need to shuffle to collect my rent. It's, did the rent come in, and did it come in on time, is really what it boils down to. So for our purposes, it really doesn't matter. Some people are picky about this. Some people have reasons to be picky about it. I know, for instance, there's an apartment complex in my hometown that everybody's monthly rent, it's all 2-bedroom apartments, so everybody's monthly rent is the same whole value. So let's, for round numbers, we'll say $1,000. Every apartment is $1,000, but the cents is your apartment number. So if you live in apartment 1, you pay $1,000.01 every month. That's how they track to see who's paid their rent. They log on to their bank account and they look for the 01, 02, 03 to see what tenant has paid their rent. And I'm like, that is the worst worst solution, because all it takes is one person to make an odd amount deposit and your solution no longer works. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of that. I would say it doesn't really matter to me how rent gets paid, as long as rent gets paid on time. It doesn't really matter to me if you want to send me 1 check or 5 checks. It's really not that big of a deal in terms of the processing time or anything on our end. And if you're making a rent payment online, the processing time is the same in both of those instances, 0. I don't have to touch your rent check, so it doesn't matter to me if you make 2 or 3 payments. Pretty straightforward on that one. As long as you're getting your payments in on a regular basis and getting them in on time, I think that that's what's most important in a situation like this. So we are coming up on the end of our hour here. That is going to be our last question. We will be posting this AMA on the Facebook page along with some resources to questions that were answered as part of this AMA after the video. You'll also be able to find this on our Facebook page at facebook.com/RentPrep, as well as, I believe, on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/RentPrep. We do run these about once a month. The best way to find out about them is to be involved in the Facebook group, because as I mentioned, we do create that event usually mid-month, and we usually run these right around the end of the month every month. But you can get your question in. You could be one of our questions in next month's episode of the AMA. I think that's pretty much it. I think we're pretty much going to be wrapped up here. And yeah, it's been good. I appreciate everybody for tuning in today. We really do appreciate you guys asking the questions, being involved in the Facebook group, because it helps us to get an insight into what's going on out in the world at large. It helps us to understand what are the struggles that landlords are facing. I mean, obviously owning a management company, we see that, or I see that as well, but it really helps us to see what's going on, not just here in our own little neck of the woods in Buffalo, but across the world and across the country. So thank you guys. Thank you for being active in the Facebook group. Thank you for tuning into these AMAs. It really does mean a lot to us. The best way to help us out is to share something like this. If there's a question that was answered in this, or in one of our podcasts, or if there's someone that you think would benefit this information, do us a favor and share this with them. It would really help us out. Again, thank you guys for listening. I'm Andrew Schultz, Community Manager here at RentPrep. We'll see you next week in October. Sorry, we'll see you next month in October for our October AMA. Thanks for watching and have a great day.